Hello and welcome to the video, How Does Pricing Work for Serverless Computing? I bet you can guess what the nature of this video is from the title, but in more detail, I'm going to show you some of the components that you're likely to pay for with serverless computing. And this is not just the Azure functions themselves, but also a few things that you may have forgotten, things like those integrations and storage accounts. And we'll also talk about the differences between the consumption plan and the app service plan. And this video, I'll focus some more detail on the consumption plan because that's kind of new to Azure Functions. And I will also talk briefly about the app service plan, and I'll describe how to keep it inexpensive, especially during development. So what are you going to have to pay for? You're going to have to pay for the Azure Function executions. And this is done through both the number of times your function runs, as well as how long it runs and how much memory it consumes. Additionally, you're going to have to pay for Azure Storage. The code that you upload for your functions is going to be stored on Azure Storage, and you'll be paying for that. But also, if you're using queues or tables or blobs as either a file repository, processing those messages, you're going to be paying for those queues and tables as well. Many of the integrations that we discussed in the previous video, things like Azure Cosmos DB or a SQL database or Event Grid, those things are also have their own costs associated with them. So if you are using those for integrations, you'll need to consider that as a cost. And finally, an Azure web application. Though your function was going to be handling the processing for you, you may still have an Azure web application or some other website that is used as a front end for your functions. The function executions is counted on the number of times it's run. First million executions per month is free. And if that sounds like you're getting a lot of, wow, that's a lot of value, keep in mind that a million executions is only 20 cents. So the million executions is great for development. You're not going to be hitting it constantly, but that first million executions, you're not even going to have to pay for that. However, that's not the only way that they count pricing meter for the Azure functions. In addition to the number of times it's run, you also pay for the resources that it consumes. And that's the resource consumption here. The average memory consumed, it's not the peak. So if you go to the highest for a very quick spike, it's not going to consider that memory consumed the entire time the function is run, but it does take the average. And it also considers the time that it takes to run, and it uses that in milliseconds. The memory is in 128 megabyte increments, and it goes up to about 1.5 gigs. It calculates it at 1 gig for each 1 second. So 1 gigabyte of memory for 1 second costs, well, about 1.5/1000th of a penny. But your first 400,000 gigabytes per second are also free. So between the executions and the consumption, you're really going to have a lot of development time where you're not having to pay for those functions until it's really into use and in prod. The function proxies, they're also an Azure function that uses an HTTP engine. And that HTTP will always use less than 128 megs, but the same pricing applies. It also runs the entire time that the function takes to complete processing and return results. It's important to keep in mind that if you are using Azure subscription that is a free Azure subscription, that is maybe an MSDN license or an MVP license or even a trial license, something that is granted you an amount of resources that are free. If you've got a monthly allowance for your Azure so that you can use a certain number of dollars of resources per month, then the free million executions is not going to be calculating. You'll be paying for that 20 cents for the first million executions as well. So you're already getting stuff for a grant. You don't also get the executions and the resource consumption for free. And finally, important to know that this is not the only model that you can pay for your Azure functions. If the consumption is not something that you're excited about, you might not want to have very low cost 1 month and then a very high. There's another method that you can use to pay for your Azure functions, and that's the app service plan. Just like a web app, you can use an app service plan instead of the consumption plan. By that, the positive side is that you'll know how much you're paying every month. The downside is that there's no development grace period for them, and there is cost for the Azure functions, no matter whether it gets used or not, because you are basically reserving that processing power for the entire month. So in this section, we learned a lot about Azure functions. We described the concepts of serverless computing and talked about some of the things that are available in Azure functions so that you can enable that serverless application architecture. Taught you about pricing and what languages you can use for your Azure functions. Also talked about some of the great use cases for Azure functions and serverless computing. Now it's time to get out of PowerPoint and into the Azure portal. So let's get into the next section where we're going to actually create our serverless application with Azure functions.